Right. Well, first of all, Morgan, I mean, when you are the leader of a country, I think you've got to be the leader of the whole country. So you can't take a narrow view of you can't say, look, this is my, whatever the policy is, my church overrides, you know, the policy that I think is in the interest of the country. Though I think the difficult thing here is that actually your religious views always, of course, colour your approach to many problems, and probably I would not have taken the same attitude to the debt campaign if I hadn't personally been involved in that church movement. But that doesn't mean but what you can't do is then surrender your, you know, your as it were, your duty to do what you actually think is right and to represent the whole country to your religion. Now, people always think religious people may do that, but actually, genuinely, usually they don't. In fact, when the governor, I think it was Al Smith, who was the first Catholic ever to stand as a presidential candidate, when he ran for office, I think it was at the end of the 20s, I think, maybe. But anyway, there was this big campaign that the Pope was going to move opposite the White House, and you know, he was there for. And I remember, because my wife was a Catholic, before the 1997 campaign, the Reverend Ian Paisley suggested that because my wife's allegiance was to Rome, then she couldn't, you know, I wouldn't really be fit to run the country. And I'm afraid I was so in time I thought, Rome, what's that? She got some Italian connection, I don't know about, but actually what it meant was, no. So I think you're going to be careful of that. And the reason, frankly, I didn't convert to Catholicism when I was Prime Minister was just, look, I had enough issues without lighting that one into all the others. So I decided to do it afterwards. But I think, you know, as a political leader, you've got to represent, in a pluralist society, you've got to be able genuinely to represent the whole of the country. I think in relation to what Joel was saying, I'm not sure about this, actually. I think there are overlapping principles, because I think, you know, both the lady with the placard and Barney Frank kind of accept that, in the end, they're both part of the Constitution. I think one of the real strengths of America is this idea that there is indeed a common space that everyone is in. I mean, one of the things you find really interesting out in the Middle East is when you explain to people in certain countries in the Middle East that as a Muslim you can worship in America. Because people actually, I've heard people say to me, no, not in America. And you say, no, absolutely no, you got millions of Muslims, you've got mosques in America. No. And it's really, you know, I think, but that's because actually it's just taken for granted, really, that this is, that in fact these principles do overlap, even with the most extreme people. And I think that's a very, very important part of a functioning society. Very, very important part, and not to be given up lightly at all. It's something that's desperately important. I was explaining to people earlier today how one of the issues I had to tackle when I was Prime Minister was that there were second-generation immigrants who would come into the UK and decide that they would, and still couldn't speak English. Second generation. And my view in the end was that actually it was part of their social obligation to do this, because otherwise we weren't cohesive as a society. Now, at one level, that's an interference with someone's freedom, but at another level, you need to create that common space. And you're right also that it evolves over time. Of course it does. This is why any religious belief, actually, that is static, in other words, takes no account of its historical setting, is so, I'm afraid, wrong in the end. I mean, it's just because time evolves. You know, in Christian times, there were slaves. St. Paul wrote about slaves having to, you know, obviously to accept the authority of their masters. Now, there's a discourse there that in our time would be considered completely absurd and unacceptable. But that's the way it is. But I think the value of having this concept of the common space is that it allows that evolution to happen, and for that space also to be enlarged and changed over time. And Amanda, just finally on your point, because Stephanie, you were asking to Nick. Well, I think if the state could make that provision, no, I think that the religious groups wouldn't have to fill the gap. But I think what's fascinating and important is that they have filled the gap. And they filled it because people were inspired by their religious belief. And that's why I think that this, as I say, I think the interesting thing about this whole debate is that it's often put in terms of religious people must accept that they can't decide what happens, as it were, just by virtue of their belief. But in actual fact, I think every bit as interesting, which is the reason why Nicholas wrote his response to a lot of what was there, is that also people who are non-religious should be open enough to the religious to accept that there are certain ideas and thoughts and values that actually can enrich society as a result of that religious belief, even if you decide I'm not a person of faith myself.
Let's let the other questions get ready. Just one quick response to what Tony said. The fact that the Muslims in the Middle East find it incredible that, when you say to them that as a Muslim you can worship in the U.S., that just reinforces the analysis I gave, that the way we have structured religion in the state is truly extraordinary, and most people find it difficult to believe. What do you mean that all the religions are treated equally? That's extremely difficult to believe. And we forget what a risky experiment it was 250 years ago. Never been tried. And I think what's behind the Hauerwas quotation is, well, I mean, Hauerwas and McIntyre also think of the state as just like a telephone company and so forth, a huge bureaucracy. But it's this nostalgic longing for once upon a time. The state was the highest expression of a morally, religiously unified citizenry. And now that's gone, and it's just into management. I think that's the nostalgia. That's putting it from the dark, frightening side. But James Madison, above all, said it has to be tried.